soul could achieve salvation through philosophical investigation. He felt that when the individual soul thinks nature is its own act, understands that nature is our own act, we're capable of attaining gnosis or insight into the essence of the intellect. But when we think that all of this is something external and objective, that's when we get into trouble. He thought both life and death are good. Life is the soul's expression of individuality and creation. And death is a state of contemplative repose. We exhaust ourselves, we exhaust our energy, and we go back into a state of rest. His two major successors were Porphyry and Iamblichus. Porphyry wanted to come up with a practical way for the soul to bring about its transference to higher realms of existence, and he thought that this could be done through virtue or good works. He also returned to astrology, saying that the stars and planets are capable of affecting and ordering human life. He felt that through an analysis of the birth chart, we could understand which planets had influence in our lives, which were most powerful, which were less powerful, and therefore we could then develop some kind of balance between these energies. And Ficino was a major astrologer and really talked a lot about this. Iamblichus posited an array of intermediate beings between the one and the souls here on earth. He established the practice of theurgy. He felt that we need more than contemplation or discussion. We also need prayer and ritual. A fourth major Neo-Platonist was Proclus, who was the head of the Platonic Academy shortly before its closing. And he was a religious universalist. He had himself initiated into all the mystery religions being practiced at the time. He felt that there was a three-part progression. There was an abstract unity, passing into a multiplicity, that's life, and then returning again to a unity that's no longer abstract, but now actualized. So we need this part here in order to be fulfilled or completed before we return. Ficino in the 15th century talked about this as an overflowing. It is in the nature of the one to simply overflow its goodness. So emanation, then a rapture or a conversion whereby lower beings were drawn back to the heaven and rejoined the gods. And then another, finally, important Neoplatonist was the pseudo-Dionysius, who created a grand synthesis of Platonic philosophy and Christian theology. So the philosophical instinct in the Italian Renaissance was to synthesize thought systems through a common universal philosophy. And although there had been Platonic and Hermetic documents in Europe before the Renaissance, it wasn't until the mid-15th century with this ecumenical council in 1438 that convened first in the city of Ferrara, then moved to Florence, that a lot of Byzantine scholars came into Italy, bringing their knowledge with them. The Constantinople, the last stronghold of the Eastern Empire, was under threat from the Turks, and the emperor felt that if he could get the western side of the church to help him, he could perhaps overthrow the Turks. So that's why this conference was convened, but it didn't work. So Constantinople did fall to the Turks, and in 1453 many more scholars came over. Cosimo de' Medici, the ruler of Florence at that time, was already sponsoring people to go and find ancient texts and bring them out. And he became inspired to start his own Platonic Academy. He appointed Marsilio Ficino as its head. He was a brilliant student, a philosopher, a linguist, astrologer, later a priest also. He was the canon of the Cathedral of Florence. He was described as a hunchback, lisping. He was prone to melancholy, but he was a brilliant and charismatic person, and he had a wide correspondence with people all over Europe from many walks of life. He translated the complete works of Plato for the first time, and the first Latin versions of this group of texts, the Corpus Hermeticum. a group of 14 texts would speak about astrology and the occult sciences as well as philosophical matters. He also wrote his own works, many of his own works, one of which is the commentary on Plato's Symposium on Love. He gave Western European readers the ability to study Platonic writings for the first time for themselves. And he wanted to integrate the ideas of Plato, Hermeticism, and Neoplatonism with Christianity. Here is the Neoplatonic Academy in Careggi, which is just outside of Florence. Cosimo gave Ficino this villa, and Ficino lived there and worked there, and they had a community of brothers in Plato, they called themselves. He was like a father figure. Members of the Academy included, after Cosimo died in 1464, his son Piero ruled just for a few years. Then came Lorenzo the Magnificent, whom probably everyone knows. So Lorenzo was here in this group. Another brilliant scholar, one of the most important of the Renaissance, Angelo Poliziano, Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, and the artists Botticelli and Michelangelo were two of the most important artists here. And they had discussions and dinners and things, and they liked to think of themselves as modeling themselves after the Platonists. They had banquets, and Ficino liked to drink wine and talk and all of this. So there were two purposes: to promote the perennial wisdom of the ancient theologians and to have a direct influence on the arts. This is a picture of, it's called Miracle of the Sacrament, and we have Ficino on the left, in the middle is Pico, and on the right is Angelo Poliziano.
Who's the artist?
I'm sorry?
Who's the artist?
The artist is Cosimo Rosselli, and it's in the Basilica of Sant'Ambrogio in Florence. Pico and Poliziano were two of the greatest Renaissance philosophers who gathered around Ficino. Poliziano came to Florence as a boy, grew up in the Medici household, and was a tutor to Lorenzo's children. He had a post at the University of Florence. He was a writer, classical scholar, and poet. Pico, in the middle, was supposed to be a very beautiful man. He died very young. He and Poliziano died more or less at the same time, and there's rumors that they were poisoned after Lorenzo's death. Pico studied at various universities, and he was perhaps the greatest of the syncretic philosophers, studying so many different philosophical traditions and combining them in his own writings. He studied many languages. He supposedly had the largest library with Kabbalistic documents, perhaps of all time, I'm not sure, but certainly during the Renaissance. In Florence at that time, there were many Jewish scholars who had fled persecution in Spain and Portugal, and Cosimo de' Medici made them welcome. So this was another thread in all of the philosophies they were studying. All right, I could speak more about that, but I'll go on now. This is Florence again, looking sort of golden, not as golden as on my computer, but Ficino talked about Florence as being a golden age, that, you know, there's this idea that the past was golden, and we want to return to this ideal state of existence. We want to bring that back. So there was a nostalgia for the Greco-Roman world. Ficino spoke of this and listed study of the liberal arts, grammar, poetry, rhetoric, painting, sculpture, architecture, and music all had come back to life now. Three strands of thought intermingled. As I said before, humanism, Hermeticism, and Platonism. We talked a little bit about Platonism and humanism. Hermeticism is next. And of course there are overlaps between Platonism and Hermeticism. They all were evolving in the same place at the same time. There are many similar ideas in them. This is a picture of someone, Hermes Trismegistus, who probably most people know, or maybe not. This is in the Siena Cathedral, right at the entryway. And at the bottom, you can't really see it, but it says, contemporary of Moses. So during the Renaissance, they thought this man, Hermes Trismegistus, was an ancient sage, that he was a real person who through purification had become divine. Ficino actually thought he was like an Egyptian Moses, and the resemblances between the writings of Hermes and Genesis led Ficino to speculate if perhaps they were the same person. He was called thrice great Hermes, the greatest of all philosophers, the greatest of all priests, and the greatest of all kings. He had been said to reveal the truth of existence. He was a syncretic combination of the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth, the god of writing and magic. His writings were thought to have predicted Christianity. So this was sort of their excuse for studying him. Because he had predicted Christianity, he must be okay, even though he was pagan. The Corpus Hermeticum is not a system of rationally thought-out philosophy, but rather records of individual souls seeking initiation in the divine, or personal salvation, or gnosis, without the aid of a personal God or Savior, through a religious approach to the universe. Perhaps that's something about the idea, Kathleen, of what you were talking about, I'm not sure. A large literature developed under his name to do with the secret virtues of plants and stones, sympathetic magic based on these virtues. He had an account of the creation of the world. Ficino, but actually, the Corpus Hermeticum was written in the 2nd and 3rd centuries in Alexandria by authors, various unknown authors, who signed his name to their works. The corpus contains elements from the Egyptian, Greek, and Judaic traditions. Ficino had an attitude of profound awe and wonder. He was busy translating Plato, and when the Corpus Hermeticum arrived in Florence, Cosimo said, "Stop, Plato, do the Corpus Hermeticum, I have to read this." And 2 years later he died, so he did have a chance to read that. That's how important he thought it was. Ficino felt that Plato took his origin from Hermes, when in fact the opposite was true. Plato came first. His translation of the 14 documents, called the Commander, had an immense diffusion. An important aspect of Hermeticism that appealed to Renaissance humanists were two things: man as magus with divine creative power, and the idea of talismans, the idea of creating images and statues which would draw down divine influence. And we'll see this later when we look at the paintings of the Renaissance, because that's in fact what they were trying to do. So there was a syncretic approach, seeking the common thread. In Hermeticism, Neo-Platonism, Kabbalah, and the writings of Ficino, the human soul holds a central and important place, connects the individual with the heavenly spheres. Every natural thing is infused with the divine essence, and similar traits are said to be repeated through all levels of reality. Now, one of the things that Ficino translated were the Orphic hymns, poetry composed during the Hellenistic period, used in spiritual rites and purification rituals, and they brought back this practice at the Platonic Academy. Ficino played a Renaissance instrument called the lira da braccio. He called it his Orphic lyre, and he wanted to remind his listener of their divine origin and to provide strength and clarity of purpose. He felt that by performing these, an individual could be brought into alignment with the harmonic frequencies of higher realms. Here's a picture by Raffaello. It's in the Vatican Palace. It's called the Parnassus, and this is a detail of Apollo and the Muses. Apollo, god of the sun.